natural science, and a Noptike, which is the inspective science of mystical transformation. It is in exploring these three stages of human development, the psychic level of Origen's exegesis, that really half my dissertation, the bulk of the argument, devotes itself to. He says this: first in Proverbs, he, being Solomon, taught the moral science, putting rules for living into the form of short and pithy maxims, as was fitting. Secondly, he covered the science known as the natural in Ecclesiastes, in this by discussing at length the things of nature and distinguishing the useless and the vain from the profitable and the essential. He counsels us to forsake vanity and cultivate things useful and upright. The inspective science he likewise proposes in this little book we now have in hand, the Song of Songs. In this, he instills in the soul the love of things divine and heavenly, using for his purpose the figure of the bride and bridegroom, and teaches us that communion must be attained by paths of charity and love. So it's to exploring these three stages that we devote the next half of the dissertation, and here I attempted to use Origen's teachings and tools a little more than just a literal reading of him. I tried to do Origen's soul level of exegesis in the soul of Origen's exegesis. So again, the first stage is the Ethike, which I amplified and explored in chapter 6. This is the egoic, heroic stage. It's the first stage of religious development, in which a soul driven by literal beliefs about itself, the world, and especially its God, gods, or religion, draws from these literal beliefs and the external teachings that they're rooted in literal tasks to accomplish, life deeds to do, and standards by which to measure itself. Our hero for this stage, Abraham, follows his calling as one of the first truly individuated souls, say some depth psychologists. He's willing to leave his father's house, that is, to leave behind anyone and everything, to sacrifice anything, even to maim his own body to accomplish his mission. Origen praises his great obedience. Likewise, Origen offers the book of Proverbs, a collection of pithy sayings that offer moral guidance and always a promised reward for compliance. But it's again, not quite as simple as it seems. Origen slyly remarks that Proverbs is a book of hidden wisdom, claiming that its real meaning of its poorly transliterated title is a cryptic wisdom, that these sayings are actually meant to challenge us with their difficulty and impossibility. Likewise, if we use Origen's tools to read Origen, if we read between the lines, then what we see in the Abraham story is the caution repeatedly offered by Carl Jung, that overzealous attempts to be moral inevitably constellate the shadow and bring about their own defeat, albeit hopefully with the payoff of greater self-knowledge. And if you'll permit the crass observation, there are those who have remarked in the story of Abraham that the reason he had to circumcise himself is because he was such a dick. While Abraham is always willing to drop everything to obey Yahweh in the story, his challenge seems rather not to be dropping anything, but actually holding on to anything. In his story, Abraham abandons his cousin, abandons his firstborn son, abandons his son's mother, attempts to slyly give away his beautiful wife not once, but twice to foreign kings, and almost murders his own son when he takes Yahweh's injunction to sacrifice Isaac a little bit too literally. The lesson from this perspective is clear. While the Ethike is a necessary and useful stage in the building of a soul and a life, it must inevitably come to an end. Otherwise, it will sabotage and eviscerate anything that it can build. The good news, however, is that in many instances, it is inevitable that one sees the impossibility of maintaining strict literal adherence to one's religion or philosophy or psychological theory. Again, one's literal ideas about self, the world, and the god or gods must, at a certain point, suffer some kind of an adjustment. Because in Origen's words, if one will not mature past literalism, one will benevolently be sent out to be tried by failure, which is a really kind way to say you will destroy your own life. Thus, the Ethike gives way to the Physique, the topic of chapter 7, which begins with a profound sense of disillusionment described in its chosen text. The book of Ecclesiastes, which opens with the injunction, everything is meaningless. A sort of death has taken place at this stage of development, which can even trigger a suicidal crisis if it's not carefully navigated. This makes sense as well, as our hero Isaac's literary journey begins on the altar with his father holding a knife above his head. For him, Genesis tells us that Yahweh was a terror. So we can see here that often the divine becomes untrustworthy, and in this stage of religious development, inherited religious beliefs are often cast off. And yet, the Physique, according to Origen, is the stage of natural science. And I had a really hard time figuring out how this disillusionment could be equated with physics, which is the literal translation of the word, the study of everything natural, until I stumbled onto the following quote from Carl Jung. He says, "By the withdrawal of the naive projections by which we have molded both the reality around us and the image of our own character, and we might say our literalist understanding of the world and ourselves, a realistic and more or less non-illusory view of the outside world comes by a stripping of the veils of illusion, the unmasking of reality, after which the reality of the world around us is recognized. The soul, bereft of the security of its now crumbling internal reality, turns outward to the real world to steady itself. Like the author of Ecclesiastes, this may take the shape of new academic pursuits, of drinking, revelry, sex, art, even profound materialism, all of which may be healthy. Whereas ethike took one away from one's own body, physique brings one back to its inherent natural intelligence, as natural intelligence is one of the goals of this season identified by Origen. But what Origen points out is that this takes on its highest expression in an eventual turn to nature as a great conveyor of numinous truth. The book of nature contains letters of divinity. I really enjoyed writing that section, actually. That said, Origen saw the greatest lesson in nature being that all things change and that death is inevitable, although death was merely understood as yet another state of transformation. At this point, poised to come to a gorgeous conclusion, focusing on the primacy of love in the spiritual life, and no doubt with my committee ready for me to be done and submit my manuscript, I instead took a momentary symbolic detour and snuck in one more chapter. I do apologize for that now. It was a good time to describe exactly how Origen understood the soul. For Origen claimed the greatest gain for a soul was self-knowledge, and this included a knowledge of the soul's structure. So I started chapter 8 with the nearly sacrificed Isaac, whom Origen praises for digging wells, as the principal movement from physique to anoptike. I explored Isaac's well-digging narrative, and I found something which I found to be rather fascinating. Immediately preceding this story, we find the incident in which Isaac, like his father, tries to pass his wife off as his sister, and nearly has a situation in which she's taken into the local king's harem. He's enacting the same behavioral pattern that resulted in Abraham abandoning his mother, again, twice. Building on Jung's insight that the ethike would constellate the shadow, and that shadow issues which are unreconciled by parents get passed on to their children, I suggested that Isaac knowingly found himself repeating an unhealthy pattern from his father's life, and, being tried by failure, immediately sought what Origen identifies as the greatest gain in health for the soul, which is self-knowledge. Remember, Isaac, Origen upholds as someone who is psychologically more developed than Abraham, so Isaac moves the ball forward of self-knowledge. His immediate reaction at this moment in the story is to leave town and start to dig wells. And in Origen's reading, the well that we ought to dig in our emulation of this story, and the well that he thinks Isaac is digging in the symbolic language, is the movement towards anoptike, the movement towards self-knowledge and self-understanding. From here, I explore the well as an original image of the human soul. I know this was Dennis's favorite chapter, and I think that's why he let me get away with it. The exploration of which requires one to go down into the underworld of the unconscious, containing the psychic waters within, which are teeming with marine animal presences. For Origen, the soul is a stormy sea, teeming with archetypes and animals. And below this, the soul finds its colder, shadowy, more remote waters of the reptilian consciousness of the Leviathan, which we interpreted as that archetypal instinctual shadow which cannot be integrated. And deeper still, the waters freeze into total unconsciousness. Psyche is the realm of both involuntary vital function, but also the frozen realm of forgetfulness in Origen's writing. I just lost my place. Wow. But for Origen, this was not always so. Forgetfulness was not the permanent state of the human soul. As Benjamin P. Blosser points out in his book on Origen's Doctrine of the Soul, Origen was thoroughly caught up in the philosophical dilemma of late antiquity, which is how to reconcile the soul's seeming division with itself, its own internal fragmentation. So for Origen, when we get down to the bottom of the soul, down into the realm of forgetfulness, if you can go past that, there's a treasure found in the depths of the ice of the frozen psyche. And that is the faintest memory of wholeness, the last vestigial recollection of the pre-existent self. For once the soul lived in blissful harmony with the divine, but some trauma disrupted this bliss and caused the soul to fall into forgetfulness and ignorance of its true nature. So you can see why self-knowledge is important to him. It's the key to remembrance and rediscovery. Origen believes this state can be restored. The goal is to draw this frozen water up into the light and allow it to thaw and eventually transmute into the higher consciousness of the nous, which is the most healthy, integrated, and divinized state of the soul. The heritage and destiny of a soul created in the image of love. And it's this idea that I then